Hello and welcome to the No Ceilings NBA Draft Show. This is a deep dives episode. I'm your host, Nick Agar-Johnson, and I am here with my co-host, Paige Otto. Paige, how are you doing this fine evening?
I'm doing great, Nick. It's good to finally be back. I know it's only been a week, but college basketball finally started. Huge performances last night that we're going to talk about at the end of this episode. But yeah, I can't complain.
Well, I feel like you could, but you don't have to. It's all good.
Yeah. Other than it's pitch black outside in Michigan at 6 p.m., but we're just going to ignore that for now.
Do our best to ignore that and move on. So, as you mentioned, we will be talking about some of the biggest performances in college basketball at the end of the episode. But one of the two players that we're going to discuss in the deep dives portion of the episode did, in fact, have a big season debut last night. So, one of the two players that we're going to talk about is playing his first game of the season as we record this. So, we might not exactly have up to date information on that. But let's start with the guy who has, in fact, finished the first game of his college season, and that's Flory Bidunga. And obviously, the big name for Kansas at this point is Darren Peterson, right? But Flory did actually outscore him in the first game. Now, granted, it was against Green Bay, and Kansas absolutely destroyed them. So there is that element to it. But certainly, Flory is someone who, was one of the top 20 recruits in his high school class and showed some real flashes last year, did not get all that much playing time. Again, we talk about small sample size alert pretty often, and one game is just about the smallest sample size you can get, but so far seems at least likely that he's going to play a larger role this season. And given what he did show in limited minutes last year, there's a lot to like about Badunga's profile going forward. So, Paige, this was your guy for this week. Why did you go with Flory for our third episode here?
Yeah, so I was super excited to bring up Flory just because 2 years ago I actually had the chance to watch him in the 4A Indiana State basketball championships and at Gainbridge Fieldhouse, and he played with Kokomo. I think he had like 23 points, 7 rebounds. Obviously, he just looked like the best player on the floor. Kokomo ended up losing in the state championship game, but I've been following his game since the beginning, really. And there's a lot to like with him. He's your typical play finishing, versatile, lob threat, rim running big, right? He's super mobile, has great length, has a huge catch radius with his super long wingspan. He's 6'10", 235 pounds, average 5.9 points, 5.4 rebounds, 0.3 assists, 1.6 blocks, with 2.7 turnovers, average a little over 2 fouls per game, shot 70% from the field, 0% from beyond the arc, with 53.3% from the line at 1.3 attempts at the line in 16.3 minutes. Obviously, you mentioned he had a smaller role last year with Kansas. He played behind, obviously, Hunter Dickinson and KJ Adams. And this year with Kansas, I'm sure we'll break down his game against Green Bay. But he's basically, this is his breakout year, right? I have him at like 22 on my big board. But there's a lot to like with him. I kind of just fall in love with his potential. He's super raw in terms of his shooting and his ball handling. You don't really want him to take more than 2 dribbles. You kind of hold your breath whenever he has to do that. But last year he only had, I believe, one of his game in his post-up game, he was in the 39th percentile, which is average on synergy. And that's a real concern when you look at your big man. And in the game with Green Bay, I think he showed a massive improvement in terms of sealing off his defenders, taking ownership and getting positioning. And obviously the 2-man game with him and Darren Peterson is a huge threat this year in college basketball, and it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. But I really like Flory, especially in terms of he just really intrigues me just because there's so much potential with him, but there's also a lot of things that he lacks in terms of, his shooting ability. He did get to the line 6 times yesterday with Green Bay. He was 5 for 6, which was super encouraging. His shot still looks a little funky, but his follow through, I think there's a lot of difference from last year. Last year, it kind of seemed like he was like launching it from the line when he got there. But yesterday it looked like he was really taking the time to actually follow through with intent rather than last year when he got there. And I really love his touch around the rim. He's very above the rim player. There's a lot of questions in terms of his game below the rim. I kind of get nervous whenever he's outside of the dunker spot, and he doesn't really have a face-up game. But yesterday with Green Bay, he definitely showed some patience in that area. Yesterday, if we're going back to last night, because I'm sure the viewers are wanting us to break down that game too. He had 23 points, 6 rebounds, 1 assist, 3 blocks, shot 82% from the field, 83% from the free throw line, which I was the most encouraged about, and only had 3 fouls in 25 minutes and 0 turnovers, may I add, which was a huge improvement because he's not very confident when he's not, in DHOs or in the pick and roll, and kind of when he's spread out, you can kind of see he gets nervous when the ball's in his hand too much, but he's very more than capable of, facing up and going right through guys. He had one of my favorite possessions of the game. Kansas was playing a 5-out offense, and he was on the perimeter, and he took it straight to the cup in 3-pound dribbles or less, and kind of did like a slow arcing Luka-esque move and finished through contact, which was super encouraging because if you looked at it last year, like he would have never have done that. Or was that his role? So that was super encouraging. And also he had some great finishes in transition. I love him in the open floor. I really think he gets down in the court in a hurry. And obviously when you play with a player of Darren Peterson's style, that's going to happen a lot this year. And obviously with Harris's departure and his usage rate going up this year, I think Flory is going to take a really big leap, and it's going to be super fun to watch.
So the biggest point from that first game that I wanted to hit on, you already covered extensively, so I won't linger on it too long, but I do want to circle back to the free throw thing because Flory Bidunga has a very simple game in a lot of ways. And what he does well, he does spectacularly. I mean, again, the small sample size of this season, there really isn't much point in going through that, but last season, 95th percentile in terms of offensive efficiency. Again, you mentioned the 70% from the floor, right? He's not exactly taking threes, as you already noted, which, does help with that. But anytime you can shoot 70% from the floor, you're doing just fine. And so that sort of leads into really where I'm at with Flory at this point, which is essentially, we talked in each of the last few episodes, I believe, about sort of the notion of one-trick ponies kind of being forced out of the league, right? And so what that I think means for Flory Bidunga is, look, he can do all the rim running stuff. He can, finish around the basket very easily. The handle is not quite, up to snuff, but again, there's a big difference in how much that matters when you're a 6'10" defensive big man versus, a 6'5" guard who's going to need to have the ball in their hands a lot, right? So that's certainly an element of it. Again, the sample size is way too small to tell if he's made any sort of improvements in terms of his touch from the line, but the fact that he got there 6 times is pretty significant in terms of, you already noted that's more than 4 times as often as he got to the line last season. Will we see that continue against other teams? Who knows? Kansas's next game is against UNC, which is going to be a very big test for basically everybody involved. But that's really sort of where I'm at with Flory Bidunga at this point. Is the offense is pretty solidified. And there's one particular detail that I thought was fascinating when digging into the numbers that I want to bring up, but we'll get to that in a minute. The main thing for me is the offensive role at this point is very simplified. It doesn't need to be more than that unless he can't get to the point where he's up to grade defensively. And 3 blocks in the opening game, solid performance. 1.5 blocks in very limited minutes last season. He's an incredible athlete. He's got the long wingspan, as you mentioned. The fouling is not, there's a whole large realm between how good the elite guys are at avoiding fouls. Like, we talked about Magoon Guath and the fact that he had significantly more blocks than fouls. That's not something you see often from young bigs. So it's not like, that ratio is off in a sense of I'm worried about Bidunga being the kind of guy who jumps at everything. But, it is certainly something worth noting that if he's going to go in that first round range, like you mentioned, you have him on your board, that will be after he is sort of proven more on the defensive end in particular. Because again, I don't see him, taking a ton of jumpers this year. The fact that he took literally 2 last year per synergy is pretty indicative of where he's at with that part of his game. But again, I mean, if you're finishing 70% from the floor and you're, 95th percentile offensive efficiency because you're just, throwing down everything you can get your hands on around the basket, you mentioned the wide catch radius. The offensive role is pretty clear. And the main question for me is just, can he get to a point where he's so good defensively that you're okay with, it's not that he takes things off the table. It's more just that, the versatility that we talked about with Guath and Alex Condon of, hey, they can be a pick and roll guy. They can be a pick and pop guy. They're, particularly in Condon's case, more than Guath's case, they're someone who you can rely on as a playmaking hub as a big man. I mean, Bidunga averaged 0.3 assists per game last season, right? That's not, the playmaking is not really part of his game. The shooting touch is not really part of his game. And so then for me, what it comes down to is he will have to do an awful lot defensively just because any team that plays him is going to need him to be the guy at the dunker spot, because he does that exceptionally well, and that's a credit to him, but there isn't much versatility in his offensive game at this point.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's kind of going to come down to, like, he is a productive offensive rebounder and a shot blocker. I think he had, let me see, I have 54 blocks, which I believe was, he led Kansas with 54 blocks and was third in the Big 12 last year. But
that's in 16 minutes a game.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And that's insanely impressive, right? And that's only going to increase this year. But there's still questions of, obviously they played Green Bay and he wasn't really tested, and especially in the post up. So, like, him ceiling, yes, it's a encouraging sign, but what is he going to do when he's, the likes of, Koa Pete or, top draft prospects that he's going to go against in the post that obviously have more strength and mobility and obviously have a better offensive game than, the likes of Green Bay that we saw, right? I just want him to get challenged more and see how he responds. And in terms of, I think you mentioned his defensive capability, like, he has to be more than a shot blocker. And then I do like him in terms of his mobility when he kind of gets kicked off the dunker spot. And I do think he can be a switchable defender if needed. He does have the ability to have hard closeouts. But then he kind of trips up when he has to recover quickly and kind of gets beat to the rim a lot as well. So I just think he needs to, act with confidence, because Kansas is going to heavily rely on him down low. And he had a lot of turnovers when he kind of has this thing that he does where if he doesn't catch the ball perfectly, he kind of gets really sped up below the rim, and he gets a lot of defenders that strip the ball away from him. And then that just causes, chaos running back and him trying to recover from that. So I would like to see him improve in that sense, because he obviously has gained strength from last year. His usage rate is obviously going to increase this year. But I think the big thing with him is that what more can he do than, the play finishing, the shot blocking, the pick and roll game? And I think just improving that, if we saw, a little face up possessions here and there that show his versatility on the offensive end, but also on the defensive end where he can guard that efficiently and effectively, I think that could go a long way for front offices and scouts as well.
I'm really glad you mentioned the confidence, because I think that's something that scouts almost exclusively talk about when it comes to shooting. And that's not the only element of it, right? And, I think for me, a significant part of just the general notion of confidence in a player is, in terms of making quick decisions, right? If you don't have that confidence, you're going to hesitate, and suddenly 0.5 seconds becomes 1 second. And, I haven't used this line this year, even though I use it 7,000 times a year. So this is the first time I'm breaking it out for this year. But, anything in college basketball that is a matter of feet in the NBA is a matter of inches. And so, the hesitation, it's a problem at all levels when you're not making quick decisions, but it becomes even more of an issue the higher levels you go up to. And so certainly, his confidence in terms of his volume from the first game shooting wise, that's a good sign that he's willing to at least take those looks. But, again, the confidence is going to be an issue. There's also the other point that you mentioned of the switchability, and that's huge for his defensive profile because, as much of an NBA ready frame as he has, he's a 6'10 tweener. And,
Yeah.
the discussion of tweener has moved over the course of the last couple of decades from, essentially 3-4 being the tweener to really now it's 4-5 being the tweener, right? Of you need to shoot and handle the ball at a relatively high level to be a 4 in the modern NBA. And so anybody who can't do that is essentially locked into being a 5. But, Bidunga's 6'9", 6'10", right? He's, certainly in terms of the frame at 235, he's going to have a wider frame than a lot of the bigs he's facing off against. But, when you talk about the true behemoths, right, he's going to need to switch at a level that teams can think of him as, okay, this is like our free safety guy who we can sort of switch across positions defensively, rather than this is going to have to be our primary guy under the basket. I am very curious about what Kansas's next game looks like, because there's a pretty big upgrade from Green Bay's front court to Caleb Wilson, Henry Visar, and Jaren Stevenson down low. And that's going to be a pretty significant test. And, with Visar in particular, I mean, his ability to, space and pass as a big man, those are the kinds of things that Bidunga will have to cover that is not necessarily the kind of big man you see often at the college level, but is increasingly more and more the kind of versatile big man, especially offensively, that you'll see at the NBA level. So that'll be a fascinating guard for him. There is one sort of element of his offense that I'm curious for your thoughts on, which I was stunned when I looked at Flory Bidunga's numbers from last year and saw just how infrequently he got out in transition, because he does really well when he gets out there, but he had 18 transition possessions all last season, which per synergy ranked in the 16th percentile in terms of frequency. And normally when you see, an athlete who gets out of the open floor like Bidunga, you expect a lot of their finishes to be in transition. And it's weird for me to kind of weigh, because on the one hand, him being as incredibly effective in the half court as he is a really good sign. On the other hand, I am confused about how he did not get more transition opportunities last year. And, again, ridiculously small sample size, but only one of his looks last night was counted as being in transition. So I'm wondering if that's, something that leads into the confidence thing, as you mentioned, of, him not having his hand up calling for the ball. But, certainly it's the kind of thing where when you talk about how well he moves up and down the floor, you'd expect him to be someone who gets those opportunities more often in transition.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a confidence thing in terms of, he only started, I believe, 6 games last year. And I think he struggled with what his role was last year in limited minutes. I think he kind of had the mindset of like, hey, like when I get in the game, I'm here to finish plays. I'm here to, play effectively in the pick and roll. I'm here to block shots. I'm here to do whatever is needed, which is like, wouldn't that translate to him, running effectively in the open court as much as possible? And it clearly didn't. But when he did, obviously he ranked in the excellent category in transition, but as you mentioned, it's a small sample size. And I think, with the likes of Harris, that he definitely had a lot of opportunities to, finish in transition and have easy looks and get rewarded. So that's definitely a question mark in terms of, why didn't he have more? And I think that is just due to what his role was with Kansas. And just to mention too, like in 550 minutes, he had 48 dunks. And I mentioned that just because, I think he's growing in terms of what his all around game can be. And I think last year it was kind of a learning wave because he had to play under, Hunter Dickinson, where he was kind of the mastermind in terms of the playmaking big, and kind of one of the main scorers for Kansas, and kind of took a lot of Flory's plate, but that's now on Flory's plate to deliver in terms of that sense. So, and Kansas too, with Hunter, having a playmaking big opens up so much for the offense. And I think Flory can definitely, improve in that area. Obviously, he had 1 assist last night. But last year, he only averaged, I believe, what was it, like 1.7, or maybe I'm thinking, or 0.3 assists. So,
yeah, he had 11 total.
He had 11
the other
total.
guy we're about to talk about.
Yeah, so with Dickinson obviously not being there anymore, I think we're gonna see a different Flory Bidunga in just terms of he's gonna look for those looks a lot more. And especially he plays so well in the short roll too, that a lot of those opportunities are going to come, I think, easier than he thinks. And I think he's going to deliver just a little bit more than last year. Obviously, I'm not asking him to have like 2 to 3 assists per game, but definitely if he can get to, 1 to 2, I think that would be a really, check mark in terms of, his vision and what else he can bring to the table than just being a play finishing above the rim type of player. And that kind of goes with what I mentioned. If he has more face up opportunities, is more patient in the short roll and the high pick and roll, I would like to see him, play more in those delay actions, which I definitely think he could be a great asset in the likes of playing off Darren Peterson. But yeah, it just, there's a lot of question marks, and we can't really go off a lot since last night, but it's definitely encouraging with the question marks I did have last year that he started off the season in such a high standard.
Yeah, as many question marks as there may be, I just want to loop back to sort of where we began, which is essentially what he does well, he does exceptionally well. And really the main question is just, can he add enough, more on the offensive end, I would argue, than the defensive end, but, can he add enough? Well, sorry, I flipped that. Can he add enough that, it's a situation where he can do enough else that he's not that sort of one trick pony that we've talked about? And I think there's plenty of reason to be optimistic, especially in terms of the defensive stuff, the switchability. He's got the athleticism for it. It's more just a matter of how he's used scheme wise defensively, but B, and more to the point, can he continue to be as impressive a shot blocker as he is while minimizing the fouling? Because, again, it's the kind of thing where you don't want him to be tentative. As you mentioned, you want him to be, taking tries at shot blocking, but there's a very fine line between, being an aggressive defender and being an overly aggressive defender. And certainly I think, given the tentativeness concerns that we've mentioned, probably be better for him to land on the side of, being a little bit more aggressive. And we'll see how that plays out over the course of the season.
Yeah, and one thing real quick before we move on to, I think because he is such a good rebounder too, he had a 22.9% defensive rebounding rate. He could have a lot of looks, with head-to-head passes. And I think that's one area of his game that it's not much to ask for. And I think that's definitely what I would like to see just a little bit more this year with his usage rate obviously going up. He's already such a huge presence there, and also put back opportunities too. I think he can definitely improve upon, and just, showing us that he can, hang with the big dogs per se down low, and just show off his versatility even more.
All right. Shall we move on to player number 2?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I'm going to throw you a curveball here because I want to get your thoughts before I give mine on the player that I chose for this week, because I still don't know if I'm out on an island on Otega Oweh or not. When we started this episode, the Kentucky-Nicholls State game was in the first half, and Oweh's stat line was not looking great. I refreshed the page, and he's doing much better in the second half, so that's a good sign. But for all of you listening, this is mid Kentucky's opening game, so we don't know what the final line looks like for Otega Oweh. But yeah, Paige, I'm curious for your thoughts because, again, I don't know how far out there I am on my Otega Oweh evaluation.
Yeah, I think I'm going to refresh the page because my browser is not working. It must be my Wi-Fi. 1 second.
And we thought I was going to be the one having Wi-Fi problems coming in.
I know, why is this not refreshing? 1 second. You need to play like the Jeopardy.
I'm not going to sing it live on air. I'm sorry. I don't have a clip for it either.
Yeah, I think when I did see, it's still not refreshing, but what does he have right now?
So at the moment, he has 13 points. He's hit looks like 4 of 9 from the field. See if I can do some quick math here. 4 of 9 from the field, 4 of 5 from the free throw line, which means 1-3. So he's 1 for 2 from 3.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's super encouraging in terms of, he hit 1-3, because with him, when you think of him, he's a tenacious defender that has that playmaking ability, but also is really good in the pick and roll, and kind of, he's going to take a lot of on too with, I saw Kentucky starting lineup, he's being the point guard tonight, which usually he is the 2 guard. So he's going to have a lot more on his plate than last year, playing with obviously Butler, Kobe Brea. So I'm excited to watch this game later. But I think the big question with Otega is kind of like, can his shooting ability translate? And with his shot, I have questions about his shot. His shot is very contorted in a way. It's kind of inverted, and it takes a long time to get off, especially when he's off the catch, right? So with him being, 6'4", 225 pounds, I believe the last time I checked. Yeah. He has such a, big frame for a 2 guard. He kind of has that Jared McCain, stocky build that, he's kind of what you want to see with undersized point guards that, have that frame and can kind of hold their own in the sense. And he can also switch. He can play multiple positions on the defensive end, which not a lot of undersized guards can. And with him having such high hopes for this year, he's SEC preseason player of the year. And obviously with his 2 seasons at Oklahoma, he got off to a huge hot start with Oklahoma. And then he kind of fell off the radar for a little bit because of his inconsistencies there with his shot. I believe he shot like 25%, and then shot this past year with Kentucky around 35.5%. Correct me if I'm wrong, but definitely when you look at his assist numbers, the same thing with his turnover rate. He's improving consistently year after year, which is a super encouraging sign. I think his second year at Oklahoma, I believe Metcalf and you were super, super high on him to start the year. And that obviously kind of, dipped and dive a little bit. But I think this year at Kentucky, there's a lot on his shoulders, and it's kind of, can he deliver? Right. But if you value, athleticism, physicality, defense, especially in your 2 guards, then, you're on the Otega train. Right. So I think this game is going to, just like, it's such a small sample size, but you get excited when you see a big game for a player draft prospect that you're high on, right? It kind of gives you a little pep in the step for the season instead of, starting off the season with like bad taste in your mouth. It's kind of like, like Condon, for example, he didn't have the best performance last night, which we will talk about later, but it kind of, doesn't start off the season like you hoped for. But just, I'm sure you'll go over the numbers too, but last year he averaged 16.2 points per game, 1.7 assists, 1.5 turnovers, 4.7 rebounds. And I love his rebounding ability, because that is one of the best traits that translates to the NBA. And I was a huge Jared McCain fan, and the same thing. He had such a high rebounding rate for the same stature as Otega. And it just really shows that, if you can get rebounding abilities off your guard, it just opens up so much for everyone that he just, he has no problem, getting in there and grabbing a rebound and, just going with it. Which when you're looking at his game too, he shot 60.5% at the rim. I really like how strong and confident he is getting there. And he just has that fearlessness about him that he has such a tight handle with the ball when he only has like 2 or 3 dribbles. But when he's attacking the rim, there's not like a question mark if he's going to make the wrong decision or, speed things up a lot. I really like how he attacks there. And he had 47 dunks on the year, only missed 4, which is super encouraging when you're an undersized guard. And when we talk about the defensive end, I love how he disrupts passing lanes. He has really good instincts when making those judgment calls. Obviously, when you're looking at Otega too, you're kind of like, that he only averaged 1.7 assists last year. But if you look at the previous 2 years at Oklahoma, he's only improved that. So 11.3 assist percent. He only had a 2.8% assist rate his first year at Oklahoma, and then 8.4% his second year. And then when you look at his turnover rate, that's only gone down as well. So I'm curious, Nick, what your thoughts on him are, since you chose him. And I don't know if I'm ranting or not, but I really like his game overall.
No, not at all. I am really glad that you brought up the developmental trajectory for him, because that is precisely why I wanted you to go first. Because the part that confused me the most about Owe last season was, as you mentioned, he got off to a really, really hot start his sophomore year at Oklahoma. He had, like 50+% from 3-point range. And then he cooled off pretty dramatically as the year went along, and he sort of fell off draft radars. And, again, to me, it feels like he kind of stayed off draft radars when, from my perspective, he improved by leaps and bounds last season. I mean, this is a guy who, you mentioned the assist percentage. What stands out to me is this is a guy who was a dramatically negative assist to turnover guy his first 2 years in college. And this past season, he had a positive assist to turnover ratio, which, again, when you're a 6'4" guard, you want that to be a little bit more than barely positive. But I mean, just in terms of the growth that he has had as a playmaker, as someone who can create things for others. I mean, you mentioned the defense and the steals in particular. He's always been exceptional as a turnover generator, as a chaos creator kind of defensive player. But really, in that sophomore year at OU, it was like, okay, can he continue to shoot this well? No, he isn't. Oh, well, sort of drop this guy off the back of radars. I mean, last year, just sort of reading some of the numbers across the board, I mean, points per game went up by almost 5 per game. But to me, what really stands out is, yeah, his 3-point percentage dipped slightly, from 38% his sophomore year to 36% last year. The 38% was buoyed by an incredibly hot start to the season and a pretty small sample size. Last year, he shot more from 3-point range than he had the year before. His frequency of free throw attempts jumped dramatically. I mean, he went from 3.5 per game to 5.5 per game, and he only played like 3.5 more minutes per game, right? It wasn't just that he went from, sort of rotation player to, big part of the lineup. It's like he started all but 4 games of his sophomore year at OU. He started every game for Kentucky last season, but it's just across the board, right? I mean, his volume through 3-point range increased, his free throw volume went up dramatically, and percentage-wise, he went from 64% to 78% last season. And as of the middle of his first game, he's at 80% from the free throw line. So hopefully that's a trend that continues. But really, for me, the thing with Otega Oweh was his sophomore year, he was a defensive specialist who had a really hot run from 3-point range. And then he fell off, and people thought, oh, okay, the 3-point shooting is a mirage. And last year, again, the percentage was lower, but he was much more consistent, from beginning of the year to the end of the year. The volume increased, the volume from the free throw line increased, and the percentage increase from the free throw line is, I've mentioned on this podcast many times before that I consider myself a partial free throw truther. And, this is one of those situations where, again, the 3-point volume is larger in his junior year than it was in his sophomore year. But really, the more dramatic increase was his frequency from the free throw line. But also, every season, the sample size from the free throw line for him has been significantly larger than the 3-point sample size. And the fact that he improved as much as he did from the line last year, to me, indicates, okay, this is someone who, had a really hot start to his sophomore year. And now in his junior year, he's started to sort of solidify some of those things that, made him as potent as he was. And so for me, I have OA as an end of the first round guy, but as a first round guy, because, when I first, thought of him as a prospect, it was, okay, this is a really impressive defensive specialist who, can he do enough with the ball in his hands to be an effective guard in the modern NBA? He's not a point guard, right? But can he do enough with the ball in his hands that he can get playing time as a 6'4" off guard? And, again, the fact that he showed as much improvement as a decision maker on the offensive end as he did is incredibly encouraging. And I think there's just, he popped onto radars during his sophomore year a lot more than I thought he did last year. But I thought what he showed last year was really establishing himself in a lot of the ways that, it feels like he'd sort of fallen off radars, and I just was confused by why he wasn't getting back on radars, because everything that you could have hoped for him to do last season, he did, and quite successfully at that.
Yeah, I think with him too, as you mentioned, like when I say he's a playmaker, he's a defensive playmaker. He had like a
Yeah,
3.1%
for sure.
steal rate, which is, you don't really want him to control the play, right? You're not going to look at him to be your main point guard, but he's a great off-ball guard to have. He's going to be capable of, defending multiple positions, disrupting passing lanes, setting up for others in that sense, which you kind of want that. You don't really want, him taking control of, getting to his shot and like his teammates setting him up a lot. That's not really his, bread and butter, but definitely he's continued to improve year after year after year. And I think that's a quality that kind of goes, under the radar a little bit in terms of, anything really, especially
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to do, right? And I think he's just a very consistent player that I think is going to garnish a lot of attention in terms of him being a true, you mentioned you have him in the first round. I think I have him maybe a little bit out of the first round. I have to check, but I definitely think he could certainly get up there for me. I just want, him to improve on the offensive end, especially with his shot. And just have more confidence in that area, because with him being such an on-ball offensive player, he's going to be open a lot, and and I want him to have more possessions than just his his first instinct is I got to get to the rim, right? He shot 60.5% at the rim, and he has such good body control for an undersized guard that he is really well adaptive when in terms of finishing through contact and going to the rim in traffic. I just think off the catch, I would like him just be more confident in his shot. His shot, I mentioned it earlier, but his shot is just a little wonky a little bit. And I just want it to be more confident and just smoother, and for and if you look at the rest of his game, it's very consistent and smooth. The only thing that's missing is like he's already undersized. Yes, he can defend. Yes, he can disrupt on the defensive end of the ball. That's not a question in anyone's eyes. But can he, provide that value, in the 2-point range? You mentioned, his free throw rate has gone up year after year, which is super encouraging. And I think with him too, with him probably going to be playing a little bit more at the lead point guard spot, I think a lot of that's going to open up for him as well, especially in the pick and roll. But I'm curious for you, Nick. Do you have any concerns with him playing point guard? Because it seems like Mark Pope is, certainly not afraid to throw him in that role, and that kind of just goes back to you can count on him as a player because he is so consistent in everything else that he does. But I think with this Kentucky team, just going into college basketball as a whole, they have a $22 million roster, which is, I believe, the highest in all of college basketball, right? So in terms of that there's a lot riding on this whole season. If you're going to spend that much money, can it end in a national championship? So a lot is on his shoulders. Not if you're not counting his consistency year after year, but can he be that player for Kentucky with the more usage that he's going to play at the one spot, which he really isn't used to, and just how he can respond, because he's been, responding the past 3 seasons. And I think he really knows that this year is kind of not a make or break year for him. But I think he's really trying to show scouts, front offices, that he can absolutely do enough on the offensive end when he has the ball in his hands more than he did last year.
So certainly this is a great opportunity for him to establish himself. I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but I'm pretty sure it was Stephen Gillespie, our colleague, who I talked about this with last year, I think also with Nathan Gribble on a separate podcast, but the notion that a lot of times it's really helpful for players who are going to be role players at the NBA level to have the experience being the lead guy. And, it's something that I think it's easy to forget that basically every single NBA player was not only the best player on their high school team, but the best player on every team that they played on up until the point where they got to the NBA. And Oweh is a fascinating case because he's not that kind of player, right? He started out being a bit player for Oklahoma during his freshman year, had that breakout moment in his sophomore year, but still for the most part was not the head of the snake offensively. And then, last season he took a huge leap in terms of offensive responsibilities and, just putting the ball in the basket more often for Kentucky than he had in either of his 2 years at Oklahoma. So I think it's very helpful for his development for him to have the ball in his hands and to get that kind of experience because, again, once he gets to the NBA level, even though I have him as a late first round guy, which is higher than most, I'm not expecting Otega Oweh to be a 30-point a game scorer at any point in his NBA career because he wasn't a 20-point a game scorer in college, right? So it's like, okay, that's not the role that I expect him to fill. The role I expect him to fill is, okay, he's going to be a defense first rotation piece. And then again, the question goes back to, can he do enough sort of point guard side of the combo guard equation, right? Like, can he do enough of the ball handling? Can he do enough playmaking for others on the offensive end in addition to his exceptional playmaking on the defensive end? And, again, it's the kind of thing where it's throwing him into the fire a bit, but, oftentimes I think that tends to, if you're looking at it purely from a long-term view, I think that tends to work out better than people think it does. I mean, part of it is something that you're very familiar with as a Suns fan of Devin Booker's first year being the point guard for Phoenix did not look pretty, but him getting that experience was, huge for his development in all the years after that. And he doesn't have his 27-7 year if he doesn't get those on-ball reps when the team around him is god awful, but he's at least sort of thrown into the fire that way. It's a bit different being thrown into the fire at the NBA level versus at the college level, but in terms of what we saw from Oweh on the ball last season, again, a barely positive assist to turnover ratio is not what you hope for out of your point guard, but he's not going to be a point guard, right? He's not someone who, there's a whole different bar for primary initiator, lead offense guys in the NBA than there is for complementary role player types of, it's not a matter of can you do everything. It's a matter of can you do enough. And so last season to me was encouraging. It would be great to see more growth from him in that area moving forward. But I think really for me, the main thing is that he did a significant portion of that work last season to go from, someone who you didn't want to have making plays for others to someone who, he's not going to throw Luka passes anytime soon, but just him getting more comfortable on the ball, him being able to get more comfortable with, okay, maybe I'm not running the offense, but if the ball swings my way, flip side of what we were talking about with Bidunga, right? Can I make a quick decision that's a good decision? And I think that him getting those point guard reps this season will be a huge part of him continuing on that growth trajectory. But I mean, he showed last season already that he was on the upswing in that regard. I mean, he turned the ball over more in his sophomore year than he had assists this past season. That's a pretty significant jump for someone who, as you mentioned, he had 5 assists his entire freshman year. And, granted, he was only playing 13 minutes a game, but 5 is, as iffy as Bidunga's low assist numbers from his freshman year were, it's a whole different ballgame when you're talking about a 6'10 athletic big man versus a 6'4 guard who doesn't quite shoot well enough to be sort of your AJ Green archetype or the example I've always used in the past, the Troy Daniels archetype, right? That's not what Oweh is going to be for you. So he needs to get to a pretty high floor in terms of the rest of his skill set. And the fact, again, that last year he started going down that path is, I think, a huge positive sign for where he can be going forward. Again, he doesn't need to be a, point guard, but any reps that he can get in terms of improving those areas of his game, I think will be huge for when he's at a point where, he's not asked to lead the offense, but he is asked to make quick, good decisions.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up of, there's a lot of, variables in terms of, can I throw, this guy in the fire, and am I confident that he can respond? I think that says a lot about, his character, his, the confidence that coaches, obviously Mark Pope has in him, and how they can respond. You mentioned Devin Booker. Obviously, as a Suns fan, I was, I'm glad you brought that up. But like, if you look at Cooper Flagg too, he's gotten reps at the point guard position too, in the NBA. And that's not a lot of people, don't have delayed gratification in this sense. In terms of, oh, this, he's not a point guard, he's not a center. Why is he playing this? It's because, in the game of basketball, it's always developing. And the more that a player can, respond in unlikely circumstances, like Oweh will this year with Kentucky, it just goes to show what type of player they can become. And being a glue guy at the NBA level, that's how you win championships, when you have those type players around your stars. And if you look at, obviously the Oklahoma City Thunder with, Lou Dort, Cason Wallace, and he kind of reminds me a little bit of Lou Dort, just his frame and size and his defensive capability. Obviously, he doesn't have the shot making ability that Lou Dort has, but just the frame and the tenacious ability kind of reminds me of him in a way. But I think that that's definitely a skill and kind of a concept that not gets forgotten, but isn't talked about enough, is that it just shows his versatility as a player. And there's a lot of other circumstances that, aren't likely, but I'm sure, in a few games from now, when, he's played the point guard position, if he does end up playing multiple games at that one spot, people are going to be like, oh my God, he should have been point guard this whole time. Like, it's just, a thing in terms of when you're talking about basketball in any sport. It's just, people aren't, reluctant to, they're not good with change, right? So when something is changed and they're not used to it, it kind of, gives a sense of, not freak out, but just the uncertainty of it. But I think he definitely will do well at the one spot, just because he's such a consistent, reliable player. And I'm super excited to see how he continues to improve this year.
I'll go with another classic no ceilings cliche. Development is not linear. There are
Yes.
going to be bumps in the road when you throw anyone who doesn't have, even on the most basic human level. If you've never done something before and you do it for the first time, you're not going to be great at it right away. Like, no matter, well, I mean, unless you're Shohei Ohtani. But other than Shohei Ohtani, if you try something that you've never done before, you're not going to be great at it right away. But the flip side of that is, again, given the growth that Oweh showed last season in terms of purely his offensive playmaking, because we're on the same page with how exceptional of a defensive playmaker he is, but purely in terms of the offensive playmaking, like, yeah, if you take someone who has been an off-ball player their entire college career and say, okay, you're our point guard now, good luck.
Yeah.
There are going to be bumps in the road for sure, but where it ends up is, okay, Mark Pope is trusting him to be the point guard. That's, first of all, that's a good sign. As much as development isn't linear, looking at his shooting numbers, those have been on a pretty sharp upward trajectory since the start of his first year, right? And that's the kind of thing where, look, I'm not in the Kentucky locker room. I do not know Otega Oweh personally, but just in terms of looking at the statistical evidence points to this is someone who's put in a lot of work in not only just their basketball development, but in the specific areas in which he needed to improve, right? Like, if he went from 1.5 steals a game to 2 steals a game from his sophomore to his junior year, great. That's an improvement, but he was already excellent at that. The fact that he's shown this kind of, I'm going to go back to the well with one of my old favorites again, but similar to Deron Holmes' shooting development, right? Of, okay, this is someone who recognizes what it is about their game that really works and what it is about their game that they need to grow to be the kind of player that they want to be. And with Oweh, I mean, just across the board, he has continued to be as good of a defensive playmaker as he always was, right? It's not the sort of offense for defense effort thing that we see with a lot of players, right? He's not slacking on the defensive end because he suddenly has a lot more offensive responsibility, but it's been a slow and steady improvement. And so part of the reason I, have been unsure about my evaluation of Oe is, again, I said this already, but I think it bears repeating. I don't know what he could have shown last year that he didn't show that would have been what people wanted to see, right? Like, okay, yeah, if he shot 45% from three all of a sudden, great, right? But just in terms of reasonable improvements that people could have expected, he took a significant leap in terms of on-ball scoring responsibility. He took a significant leap in terms of offensive playmaking for others. He continued to be as great of a defender as he was. His rebounding rate went up pretty significantly as well. Like, I don't know what he could have shown last year that would have made people change their opinions on him. And the fact that he got so much more attention his sophomore year than last year is what's sort of throwing me for a loop, because again, he fell off radars when he cooled off during his sophomore year, but anything that you could have wanted to see from him last season at Kentucky, he did. And certainly given the responsibility of him, starting out as the point guard for Kentucky, that's another whole level of responsibility. And if he can live up to that and continue on his upward trajectory, then, it's a similar thing to the argument that I and you and many No Ceilings people made about Deke Clifford last season. Like, yeah, okay, sure, he's a senior. He's an older prospect who, isn't this superstar in any one particular area, but like, what kind of role player things would you want Otega Oweh to do that he hasn't either already shown at a very high level or at a minimum shown consistent improvement in that area?
Yeah. I think we're in this day and age too that people just want, well, he's a two guard. He should be shooting 38% from three. He should be having, 4 assists per game. And that's just not the type of player he is, right? And I think with any success, there has to be failures. And of course, any prospect is going to, have some bummy games, if you will, across the season, but it's kind of like how you respond and play. And Otega Oweh is a player that responds, game after game, season after season. And if you just look, from 2 years ago to now, he definitely is going to make improvements this year. And just looking at the game just ended, Nick. But he had 13 points, 3 rebounds, 0 assists, 1 steal, 3 turnovers, 4 of 9 from the field, 1 of 2 from 3, and was 4 of 5 from the line. So, and 2 fouls. So if not the greatest performance in terms of what we were talking about that we wanted him to improve on, definitely the 0 to 3 assist to turnover ratio isn't the best, but I'm sure we'll watch the game later. But definitely not what we hope for in terms of, playing the likes of, Nicholas. But, we'll see how it goes for the next season. But definitely not the best start at the point guard position for him.
I don't know what you're talking about. 50% from 3-point range, 80% from the free throw line. What more could you ask for? We can ignore the rest of that.
I know, I'm such a downer.
Yeah, how dare you, honestly. Anyway, shall we move on to our quick hits, puddle jumps, and close this out?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so before we wrap things up, just sort of a brief overview. As we are recording this on Tuesday night, college basketball season officially started yesterday. So, as mentioned, some players have already played their first game. Some players finished their first game while we were live on air recording this podcast. But, what has stood out to you the most through the first couple of games-ish of the college season?
Yeah, I think the big headliner was obviously Florida against Arizona in the Hall of Fame series. And everyone's talking about Koa Pete. They're calling him the next Paolo Banchero. Which is, a hefty name to live up to. But if you look at, the box score, 30 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists, 3 steals, 1 block. He had the best freshman debut in Arizona history. And I think I saw a stat that he was the second highest points in freshman ever. I forget who it was behind, but
probably Wilt with like 73.
Yeah. But there's a lot of Koa Pete fans. I know Nathan's a huge Koa Pete fan. and was blowing up the group chat last night watching his performance. But he definitely, not surprised a lot of us, but definitely answered a lot of questions for us in terms of he just absolutely dominated. He also had a dunk of the year candidate early on. And he's just so smooth in the mid-range and so patient. And as a freshman, he plays like a 18-year-old senior. That's how I describe his game. He's just so disruptive in terms of he's so confident in what he can do, and he's absolutely gonna, take it to you. I know you're a huge Condon fan. We talked about him last episode. Wasn't his best performance, and not a good performance overall for the defending national champs either. But definitely his performance definitely stood out. AJ Devansa, Darren Peterson, the big three, had 20-plus point games. Darren had 4 rebounds, 3 assists, was 7-11 from the field. Caleb Wilson, 22 points. Darius Acuff, I cannot talk. It's late. 22 points, 4 assists. Malik Thomas, I know we have a lot of fans. I know Rutgers is a huge fan of him. And also Auburn almost lost yesterday. And then Boise State got upset by a D2 Hawaii school. So a lot of fun and exciting times. You never know what you can get when the college basketball season starts, but definitely a lot of great freshman debuts. I forget who tweeted it out, but I thought it was funny. It was like X thinks there's like 57 first-round picks after the first night of college basketball, which is so true. I mean, my feed was just like, every guy could be number 1.
Yeah.
And it's just everyone's just happy to have college basketball back. And I think if you look at the flip side of the Florida game, Xavier Lee, Boogie Flan didn't have the best game, but he did make a layup, a few of them. Yeah, I think definitely there's a lot of question marks if you're a Florida fan in terms of, your front court. But definitely encouraging if you're a Koa Pete fan.
Yeah, I was going to start with Koa Pete as well. And I think, it leads into a couple of things that we've talked about today. Obviously, Darren Peterson had his debut in the same game that Flory Bidunga played because, they're on the same team, as we already talked about, right? But there's a big difference in having a huge debut game against Green Bay or against Nichols, right? Versus Koa Pete had his debut against the reigning national champion. And they have a front court with at least 1, probably 2, maybe 3 NBA players, depending on how you feel about Thomas Houck, Alex Condon, and Micah Hanlockton. But, again, it's a big difference when you have that 37-5-3 debut against the reigning national champion versus, not to be unkind, but let's be honest here, a cupcake, right? Like, Kansas did not book Green Bay expecting that to be a particularly close game. Whereas, Arizona, Florida, I was like, okay, this is the marquee game, right, of the opening of the college season. And not only was it the marquee game, but, and not only was it against the reigning national champions, it was against the reigning national champions who have an incredibly loaded front court. And Koa Pete was just taking them to school all night. So the fact that he did not attempt a jump shot is, maybe not something you want to see in the long term, but if you can put up 37-5-3 against that front court, maybe you don't need to. Right. And, him getting to the line 12 times as well, that's a huge part of whether he's going to be as effective as people hope he can be going forward, just continuing to get to the line. Because when you're as impossible to stop of a downhill force as Koa Pete is, just getting to the line constantly is going to be a huge part of your scoring. So, again, no shots from outside of like 3 feet and 8 of 12 from the free throw line, those are the nits that you would pick, right? But the flip side of that is it wasn't just an exceptionally impressive, historically impressive rookie debut. It was also that he was doing it against maybe the single toughest matchup that any of these freshmen faced on their opening night. So I was extraordinarily impressed by what Koa Pete did, and certainly not alone, but that's a huge part of it for me. Is not only was it that incredibly impressive debut, but just about anyone could have been forgiven for, okay, this is not my best night, right? Like if he had a stinker, I don't think anybody should be, at least, but I don't think anybody would be judging him particularly harshly for it because of who he was up against. And instead it was, he's going to be a problem, because if he can do this against this Florida team, like, who's going to be able to stay in front of him? Because, as rough a night as Alex Condon had, not looking particularly great for your boy over here, given what we did on our previous episode, but that's the kind of veteran, experienced front court that you would expect someone like Koa Pete to struggle against, and instead he was just dominant all night long.
Yeah, totally agree. And just to note on this freshman class, it could be one of the best freshman classes we've seen in a while. 18 key freshmen had scored in double figures in their debuts, which is a huge night in terms of, if you're a draft fan, college basketball fan. A lot of new names too, if you're not, too familiar and you're just getting into the swing of things, and are one of the few people that, like us, watch college basketball in November. But definitely, if in like the other headliner game in the Hall of Fame series, obviously BYU, Villanova, AJ's debut, one of the big three. He didn't have the best night at the line, but he definitely showed, his body control, his physicality, his versatility, that a lot of people are excited for. And BYU got a big win over Villanova, 71-66. And he came up with a lot of big plays that I think, even as a freshman and, obviously his skill set is very encouraging to see, especially, playing on a national stage in your first game and not playing, a cupcake matchup, as you mentioned. So I was really happy with his debut, and he missed a few layups here and there, but he also had, 3 assists, 0 turnovers, which was super encouraging too. So I was really happy with that.
Yeah, that's honestly going to be most of what I'm focusing on with AJ this year, is the playmaking and the offensive playmaking and the defense, because he's an elite shot creator. That's not something that, he particularly needs work on, right? Like, that's going to be the foundation of his game. And so then the question is, okay, going back to the previous discussions we've had, right, of, as quote unquote one trick ponies are getting drummed out. And to be clear, he's not that by any stretch of the imagination, but the sort of concept being, okay, we know that he's got this exceptional isolation scoring game. We know that, with his 6'9" frame and his body control, as you mentioned, and his fluidity athletically, this is someone who, even once you get to the NBA level, there aren't going to be all that many people who can guard him. And then, really the questions that I have around AJ sort of stem around the notion of, again, let's say you have a bad night scoring wise. Let's say you have an 8 for 23 game, like nothing's falling, everything you're trying on the offensive end isn't working out. What else can you do? Right? Because the question of what he can do on the offensive end, to me, is pretty clear. It's like, okay, again, elite one-on-one scorer. Can he do enough playmaking? And really, it's going to be a matter of, can he do enough defensively? Because he's going to earn his way onto the floor with his offensive game, right? The question is just, can he get to a point where he doesn't even need to be a massive positive, although I think he has the tools to be a positive defender. It's more of a question of, how good defensively can he be? Because that's sort of going to be the difference between, okay, this is a score first, score second, score third type, versus, okay, this is someone who, can be a potential all-star, all-NBA type. Like, and, Andrew Wiggins was not a bad number 1 overall pick. He made an all-star game, won a title, right? If that's sort of where AJ sits, that's a perfectly fine career. But given the expectations around him, that would arguably be a bit of a disappointment if he ends up just being someone who works his way onto one all-star team, has a couple of 20-point per game seasons, but for the most part kind of struggles until he can get into a context with, better players around him, to the point where he's the second, third, fourth option, right? That would be again, perfectly fine career, not what people are hoping for with AJ at this point. And I think a whole lot of that rests on what he can do defensively because, playmaking stuff offensively would be nice, but it's not like anybody's going to be unhappy with an offensive possession that ends with AJ shooting the ball, unless it's like he takes a 37-footer with 22 seconds left on the shot clock. It's like, okay, that would be a stupid shot for anyone to take, right? But
Yeah.
that's not going to be the concern for me with AJ. It's going to be what else can he do? Because the scoring part of his game, I'm pretty confident in.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I know we're ready to close things out, but I just want to mention Caleb Wilson too. I was really encouraged by his debut. He was, let me see here. I saw a really cool stat. Yeah, he became the 5th North Carolina freshman to score 21 points in his debut. And he just had a lot of impact all around against Central Arkansas. Obviously, not the best opponent, right? But definitely with his rebound ability as well and his frame, he definitely affected the game in multiple levels. And he kind of, was under the radar in terms of, top matchups to watch last night. But definitely just want to point him out too. And then I know we're talking about last night, but Cam Boozer is playing right now against Texas. Just to shout that out. He currently has 0 points, but he has 1 rebound and 1 steal. And it's 0 of 2 from beyond the arc and 0 of 4 from the field. So not the best start in 9 minutes, but just wanted to point that out that obviously this game will finish when we're done. But yeah.
Unless you're Steven, you will not be listening to this podcast before our article on Wednesday morning goes out. But suffice it to say that Caleb Wilson fans will be very happy when they see our first article go up on Wednesday morning. So be sure to check that out if you're a Caleb Wilson fan, or honestly, if you're just an NBA draft fan. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Paige, anything else before we wrap up this particular episode?
Yeah, no, I'm all good.
All right, well, that will do it for us. Thank you, as always, to my co-host, Paige Otto. You can find her on social media at Paige Otto _. You can find me on Blue Sky at NBA Johnson. You can find No Ceilings across various social media platforms at No Ceilings NBA, No Ceilings TV on YouTube. Again, as I mentioned, we have a special article coming out slightly after this podcast, although for the vast majority of people, you'll probably be getting those in your inbox/podcast player at a pretty similar time. So shout out to you, Steven. For everybody else, be sure to check out our article on Wednesday morning. It's a fun one. We got a lot of great stuff going up at No Ceilings this week. We have a loaded schedule. And, obviously with the start of the college basketball season, there's a lot to talk about. So thank you for joining us. If you've been enjoying the show, please take the time to leave a rating and or a review in whatever podcast player you might be using. That is always much appreciated on our end. And if you have any feedback regarding the deep dives portion of the podcast, feel free to reach out to me either on Blue Sky or via email, nickaj.nba@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.